All right, this is the meeting brief for May 9th, 2022 meeting at 6 p.m. for Dalton Township regular board meeting. And we begin with our normal things. Of course, in the scan packet put online, the treasurer's report isn't in there. And this has been a problem the whole time. So before I had gotten in, the normal day to get out the packets is the Friday before the meeting, for that Monday meeting. And I moved it back to Wednesday to give the trustees more time to review the packet. The issue is at the beginning of the month, you have the financial statements coming in from the banks, and so you need those to generate the treasury's report, so there's always a very close timing issue there with getting that done. And I still, I've said I'm going to get them out and scanned and emailed them to the trustees on Wednesday. We normally get them posted on the website if everything's working well on Thursday. And so that, just one statement wasn't in to be adjusted at that time on this one. And so Christy will give that verbally at the board meeting, and then she was able to print them off and put them with the trustees' packets. So they will have them to review. That's just why it's not in the scan packet. And paying bills, fire department report, planning commission report, zoning board of appeals report, all that. People go over those in the meeting and in those specific meetings that are posted if they want, so I won't go over the details there. We get into our decision items, and the first one we have is the board review poverty exemption update. And now the laws on these have changed, so our policy has to change on them for it to be legal. And the biggest change in there is that there have to be objective standards for the poverty exemptions. It can't be at the discretion, like the reasonable discretion of the board of review for extenuating circumstances like it was in the past. And so I worked with Donna, who is the contracted assessor through the county that is above the assessor that's specifically in our office, essentially, with getting these worked out in this objective standard so that they meet the laws and work. Next, we have Resolution 2022-16 for Arpa Fund expenditures. So at the end of April was the first reporting for expenses of Arpa funds. The ARPA funds have a crazy history because they were put through at the federal level as a political move, of course. I think indicative of bad things in our economy, which is very unfortunate. But for the township to not take the money, it just penalizes our citizens in comparison to other people without giving it back to the taxes eventually to anyone anyways, because the state will just end up appropriating and spending that money. And so, relatively bad situation as far as that goes overall. And then, at first, it was put through without very much in the way of rules because it was a political move at that federal level. And then the rules were coming out as super strict. You had to either expand water, expand sewer, or expand broadband. That's why initially I contacted a bunch of companies about expanding broadband and tried to get that to go. We ended up not having any companies interested in expanding broadband, and I am still trying to talk to Comcast. I recently contacted the commission that oversees utilities to try to get some things to move there, but it's very hard because in 2019 the township signed the franchise agreements with them, and I think the numbers for hitting what they need to as far as broadband connectivity for that 10-year contract are pretty easy for them. But how we would even tell that is we need some numbers from them. So I'm working on getting them. I haven't been able to get them for my last year of requests for those things, so I'm working on that. The final ruling, because there was a long period of uncertainty on that, and actually I was talking with our auditor, Eric, and he was saying he was at a seminar learning more about ARPA funds because the government and private organizations are just going wild with all these seminars on ARPA funds, like an entire new industry of training people about all the rules around ARPA funds. And he was at a seminar trying to learn some more things about it, and there someone had asked, if I have more questions, who should I contact? And at the seminar, they said, if you have more questions, have the supervisor, the mayor, whoever it may be, contact the auditor for the municipality. And Eric said he was sitting there, and he's at the seminar trying to learn more because there's no special information coming to the auditors. So he knew that wasn't a true answer. So much uncertainty around that. The way the final rule came through, which the final rule was approved about the turn of the year, right in January there, is over 400 pages is the final rule. But it ended up being way more flexible, especially for municipalities that are getting less than $10 million, which we're way below. We're a little above $800,000. And so there's a lot more flexibility there for government services. And then I wanted to get past, I didn't want to make decisions, start expending things when we didn't know what the rules were. And then I wanted to get past the first reporting period because I assumed, the way all these programs go, that there were going to be a bunch of problems, and there are. There are a bunch of municipalities having issues with reporting their information through the state treasury. And so I'd write a couple of things, otherwise Lori did the rest of the report, and she got the confirmation that our reporting went through. And I wanted to keep that as simple as possible, which is that we've expended $0 of the Arpa fund so far. So that worked out decently well. Now that we're past that point, we're looking at making moves for the first time and actually spending them. We've talked about it as a board. And so the way I have a resolution written up in here, which is not certain that you need to write a resolution for this, but I wrote this resolution, I gave it to the auditor, and he thought that it was a good idea, and that I formatted it in such a way that it made sense. And so the roads that we're contracting with, the normal road things that the township does, a couple $100,000 this year, $197,000 I believe is what the contract comes out to officially for this year. If we cover those for the next 2 years out of the Arpa funds, that really helps the budget significantly, because we have the immense amount of debt in the sewer, which is its own financial disaster, and that will be discussed in this meeting as well. And I've been talking about that and trying to figure out how to solve that couple $1 million gap, kicking it down the road. We're getting near the end of that road. So it was a bad plan before, and it becomes a worse plan the further you go with it. And obviously we started doing property sales, and if we put $500,000 towards that, then the way it looks in the budget for this year, for instance, we have $425,000 in extra revenue that is planned to be generated through property sales. It's obviously a guess, but we're moving toward it already. And so if we were to include that in the place that it goes in the budget, it adds to the overall revenue. If we move that over to sewer, we include it in revenue and expense for the sewer. And so you're either counting it twice, or you're eliminating both those, and then you're counting it once, but you're not counting it as an expense. And so, like before, when I talked about the budget looks better than it is because of that revenue from the property sales. And so by covering the roads, which we'd already be spending money on, preferably, hopefully we don't cut funding for the roads, and I think that would be a bad plan. They're important, so we should try, even if the township is having financial trouble, to keep putting some money into roads. So if we cover a couple $100,000 this year and next year out of the Arpa funds toward the roads, then it essentially makes up that gap, and so the funding in the budget looks appropriate. It works out good for that. We needed to be covering something with the Arpa funds that we're already going to be covering to free up some of that money, and which this is. I also included security, which would be a minor amount. These the next few things are things that I could spend the money on within my discretionary purchasing limits, but I still want them included because the Arpa is going to be funny because the feds and the state treasury are involved, and there's definitely going to be a bunch of municipalities with complications on it. So giving us a resolution like this gives us a good founding. And so security, which is a couple of cameras on the doors and one on the drop box. The state's been discussing that for drop box for ballots, maybe there should be a camera on them, which seems pretty reasonable. The AV, audio visual for the township hall, that one is more expensive, and so that more expensive than I wanted, but it looks like somewhere between 10 and 15 grand probably for that system. But as everyone knows, our audio and visual system there isn't very good, and I know that's part of the reason that some people don't watch the meetings, because they're hard to understand and hear. And so want to get that going. We set up a $50 webcam, and the fire chief ran the cord through the ceiling, and we used an old fire laptop that they weren't using anymore because it doesn't work very well at all. And so that's the system we have now. It was good. It was a good temporary solution, but this year I wanted to get to a good AV setup. And then I have the website in there. Now the website is undetermined, and we still have bids rolling in on it. I just had a meeting today. I'll have a meeting next week about it, and it'll be a longer term thing. Ours obviously is older. It doesn't work that well. It's not easy to navigate. It's hard to find the information, and there is a communication problem. And people have been talking about how to solve that, and solving it by doing extra mailings to everyone in the township is not a great solution. I don't think. It's a few $1,000s, several $1,000s each time we do a mailing to everyone in the township. And for that type of money, we can get a better website going. We can get an email list on the website going. We can shoot these videos and put those on YouTube, and that way people will be able to access what they need. As part of that, which that could be more money, but we'll address that with a later resolution if we need to. And with that is Municode. Municode was just recently purchased by Civics Plus, so some stuff had changed there from when I was getting quotes before. But it's a program specifically designed for putting ordinances online. And ordinances here in the past have been such a mess to access, because do you have the fully updated ones online and this type of thing, and the general ordinances. And just a few years ago, Lorraine put them together actually, because there were ordinances passed, but they weren't collected anywhere. There wasn't even a book that you could reference. So if you don't know what laws are in place, how do you possibly have rule of law? It makes no sense. It's a horrible situation. And so with this, it's tons of municipalities use it, and it works pretty well. And they update every quarter. So every 3 months, it would be any ordinance changes that have been made are up there. They're accessible, an easy link, easier to navigate. And so through these types of adjustments, we can work out any of these communication and access issues that people have. So those are the things included in this ARPA fund resolution. Obviously, the parks and the lakes have come up, and they're going to be more of a longer debate about this, but I think these are some of the important things, and I think the roads coming out of there help a lot with our budget overall, and they're very important, and they're going to be big numbers, and so we'll probably spend half or a little over half of potentially of the ARPA funds on road things, and I think that's good. I think that's important. You can spend. There isn't a limit to the amount of money you can spend on these things, so it goes pretty fast. And when you start diving into lakes and parks, that can eat up the money as well. And so it's going to be more limited on that aspect if we include the roads. But I still think that's a good idea. Next, we have the land sale policy. Obviously, the township board has struggled with the land sale policy so far, which is a little over a year with setting minimums. And I think there's been some confusion between the idea of minimums and the idea of asking price, which is more retail idea rather than the municipal idea of bidding with a minimum. And so we have to work out something that's pretty decent. The idea has been brought up of having multiple appraisals done. Lexi spent a ridiculous amount of time trying to get appraisers to appraise the land for $50 each, almost impossible to do. Normal appraisals somewhere between $300 and $500. And if we're doing multiples of those, it pushes it out in the future, because obviously those are going to have to be arranged on time, and then it raises that cost quite a bit as well. So we're adding more bureaucracy, which isn't always a bad thing. Like, things are clunky through the government for some reasons. Now, I think some of the things that shouldn't be clunky are, and some of the things that should be clunky are not, so they end up reversed in a lot of ways. But nevertheless, it is a possibility. We could have appraisals as an option on the request form. You end up with some of the same logistic and cost issues. We could do realtor listings, which has been mentioned to me a number of times by staff at the county and different things, and is an obvious solution. The issue with that, and why I haven't gone in that direction, is because you have the big question of who, and everyone knows a handful of realtors, because that's just the way that industry works. So you have all those potential conflicts, and you're probably throwing a lot of the property at one, unless you're trying to split it up into areas in some odd way. And now you're adding in the fees, obviously, that realtors charge, the percentage that's on there as well. And then you also have it now not going through the board. And I know the board at multiple points so far that I've been in office has mentioned that not so many things need to go through the board, but I tend in that direction of bringing them up for discussion and showing them and how it's working. And so you're inevitably, if you go through a realtor and then the price is just being worked out, with me negotiating the price through a realtor with somebody else, there's going to be a generation of rumors behind the scenes. I mean, there always is anyways. It's politics. But I still would like to keep it going through the board, which also avoids that problem and also avoids a number of those fees. And so as an organic process, the property sales have been working decently well. We just have to come to a better policy on this. I came up with the idea of doing it over 3 meetings. So someone would put in a request. The board itself would review the request, and when we're voting on whether to accept the request or not, because someone could technically put in a request for the transfer station. We're obviously not going to sell the transfer station unless it's a decent offer, and so that would be rejected. Now, right now, I'd administratively reject that. But we could just have that as a process that comes before the board, and then at that time, depending on which property is, a process could be set up of how we want to come up with a number. Then in the next meeting, we could put it up for bid, and then in the next meeting, we could open the bids. But again, you're adding in more time, you're adding in more bureaucracy, so not necessarily perfect. The direction that I like the best is to just do it with the assessor here at the township, because they have a way that they calculate the true cash value of a property. And as far as I can tell, they come in low, they come in conservative. Now that's part of because the market is way up and really high right now, but it's kind of nice to know that about assessing, that it comes in decently low, where compared to if you use a sales comparison in the area, the numbers come out a lot higher, and we have that with the Duff House, so I can go over that specifically in 2 items. And so that seems like it eliminates bureaucracy, it eliminates costs, makes it simpler, more straightforward. And then if it's an unusual property for some reason and should be treated with more special care of some form, then I could decide, or the board could decide, that we need to hire a professional appraiser, or if we want to try to reach out to realtors to get a cheaper version of an appraisal or a market analysis. So I think that smooths it out, and then it's just used as a guideline. And if someone wants to make the case that the number should be different than what that true cash value is, then they should come to that first meeting when it's coming up for bid and make their case there, so that the board can consider that situation. Next, we have the 5.6 acres on Russell Road that's up for bid, the 4 parcels, which obviously triggered this review. And so we ended up with a number of different opinions on this with a wide range. And so the board is going to have to decide what we're doing with the policy, and then next we can decide on what the minimum price on this piece of land should be when it's going up for bid. Next, we have 2370 Duff Road, which is coming up for bid, and so which I was mentioned before, and this is a rental house that the township owns on a lake, and it's kind of on the south side of North Lake. And an unusual situation, and for pricing on this, the official, the $500 appraiser came up with a price of $284,000 based on sales comparisons in the area. The assessor, the way they calculate it as the true cash value, which they use for assessing, which is different than what something sells for, is only $140,000. So it always comes in conservative. That is quite a bit conservative. Which before people have brought up that we'd sell all of our land for more money if we used a realtor, and I'm not convinced of that at all. We just sold almost 30 acres. I think it was 28.97 right in there acres on Russell Road, 28.79, one of those two, on Russell Road for over $200,000. And I think with a realtor it would have sold for less, and I think that's pretty clear, because there wouldn't have been the idea that you have to put in, if you really want it, you have to put in the amount that you're really willing to go up to on it. Otherwise, you could lose it and you could have that regret. 2370 Duff is this rental house, and the way I found out about it is that I got into office. I didn't know the township owned a rental house. If I had ever heard that in the past, I probably dismissed it. It seems like a weird idea. It doesn't seem to me like the township should be renting out houses. Right? I mean, if you're going in that direction, why don't we have a bunch of apartments owned by the township? That's a horrible direction to go. And so I came into office in that winter of November 2020 was the election. Come into the office. In that winter, I find out, right, I'm informed by staff that we are having water trouble at our rental house. And it was surprising because I'm like, is this a me problem? My rental house? Am I running a rental house right now? And turns out we're having water trouble at our rental house, and which is a major issue. Went out there and everything wasn't in very good shape. And it's one of those things that it's weird. It's a weird situation, and people don't know what to do. People in this role don't know what to do, and so they just kind of leave it. They just kind of ignore it, and I get that, but you have to tackle the problem in some way. And so it's a weird feeling because I didn't think I'd be taking on the potential role of a slumlord as the supervisor. And we have a family living in there. We can't have water trouble in winter with a family in a rental house. And so we get that resolved, costs a few $1,000s. And then I'd asked somewhere in that process of when the septic had been done, and no one knew. And the renter had been in there for a while. I can't remember if it's 6 years, 9 years, somewhere along there. She'd been in there for a while. And during that time, the septic had never been done. I'm like, well, our rental house is on a lake. Like, that's a potential issue if the septic's overflowing and no one's been checking it. It was a disaster to try to find. Eventually, a maintenance guy and I had stepped it off from a county health department map, and we found that the septic system had been bricked over. Luckily, we got that pumped and it hadn't overflowed, because that could have been tens of thousands of dollars of a disaster. And so at that time, the renter that was in there, she even inquired into saying, hey, like, I would rather buy this thing rather than renting it from the township. And I was like, that would be nice, because I would prefer to sell this thing rather than having the township rent it, and as the township shouldn't. And I looked into the deed. We looked into the deed here. And it turns out it was deeded to the township in 1959 with a restriction for township use. And so it's a small piece of land. It's like 2.28 acres, I think. It's a small piece of land. And it might not be quite that small, but nevertheless, it's small. It'd be weird to turn into a park. It would cost a bunch of money. You'd have to tear the house down and install some things. And then you can only park a few cars in total if you turn it into a park. So very weird piece for that. So I understand why no one's done anything since that time, and they've just been renting it out and renting it for this cheap rate. And I said, I have a bunch of other things to work on, to deal with, try to sort out, to try to fix. And so this looks like some sort of legal issue. I'll loop back around to it. And so we went through the summer, went through the winter. We're going around to the budget this year. So this winter, I was bringing up that issue again. And it's like, well, we should do some repairs at the rental house because some things should be done. But it's also at this very cheap rent, is at $600 a month. And so that should really be raised as too, because that doesn't seem fiscally responsible for the township to be doing. And so some things need to change. It would be even better if we could just not be a renter, right? The township shouldn't have rental houses. And so at that time, we contacted a title company. The title company said the laws have changed since 1959, and the use of funds, the use of money, is considered a township use so that it can be sold off. And it was good to hear that the problem could be solved, but I didn't fully believe it. Obviously, I'm a little skeptical. I have a skeptical nature anyway, so I ran that by the lawyer as well, and he confirmed that yes, it can be sold. And so that works out pretty good. Now, I wasn't going to ask a renter, especially a renter with a family, to get out in winter, and so I talked with her about what would be a good time for her to get out, and it seemed reasonable for it to occur in the spring. And so we ended up doing that, because it wouldn't make sense for us to cut like a backroom deal with that renter to sell the property. It should go through the same process that the other sales go through, which is a bidding process. And so that makes sense to follow that thing rather than doing something behind the scenes. And so we are working on that and working on making this go through and making this happen. And she ended up getting out at the same time the fiscal year changes over, so it ended up working out great. We actually couldn't find her paperwork from the beginning as far as the finances, and I assumed she paid some sort of security deposit, and she thought so too, but we weren't certain, so I just had them not pay the last month's rent, and we called everything even, everything good moving forward from there. And so the house is open, and we hired a professional appraiser to do a full appraisal on that, and the full appraisal is in the reference packet. I'll go over that after I get through these items. But I got the opinion from the assessor on that as well. And so that's the basic situation with the 2370 Duff Road house, which is an interesting history, problem we're trying to solve. Next is the contract with the Road Commission, and this is the $197,000 contract with the Road Commission for maintaining various roads throughout the township. Next is the Michelinda contract with the Road Commission, because it had passed for paving after about 12 months that it ended up taking for that full paperwork process, but that ended up going through. Now, the county had originally signed their contract. They made up the contract and they signed it for the top line was $318,000 back in October of last year, because that's, they were to the point of being able to sign a contract at the point. We had a bunch of paperwork left to go on the township level. But in that fall, those millions became available for that discounted price, and I had decided to move on that because it saved a decent amount of money. And so that quote changed from $318,000 to $229,000 over the winter. And now that everything's through, we can sign the contract, we can approve the contract and sign it and get that moving. But I don't want to sign a contract for $318,000, which we actually have financing for $229,000, because that's the real quote now. The Road Commission also doesn't want to take it back to the board for approval because it's higher than the numbers, so they're good on their side. And I requested that they put in the numbers as they are as of now, at the discounted price into that form, which at first they weren't going to do. And so I contacted the lawyer, and they wanted to draw a line through it and date it and initial it like you do. And then with that form as an example for the Road Commission, they ended up adjusting those numbers. So we have the real contract in here that actually needs to be signed for that lower amount. Next, we have the Michelinda assessment payment, because controversially decided that since the horse trail is one of those parcels, gives access to the horse trail along Michelinda, that the township is exempt from paying the special assessment tax, but because it does get traffic, it should just pay the special assessment tax like any other person would. And so it only makes sense for the township to approve and pay off the township's own portion of that special assessment tax. Next, we have our discussion items. The first one is the employee vacation policy. So the fire chief had brought this up to me originally when I first got in. It was one of those things that, all right, it's a problem, and we'll get to it to review, and it's coming up now. And then some of the maintenance personnel had brought it up as well. And so for part-time and seasonal people, it's not really clear on how many days you should get off for vacation. It is on paid holidays, and it is on paid personal time off, but not on vacation, because it goes by how many days you're going to be working during the week, which doesn't work out great if you're taking care of grounds because there's weather considerations. So it'd be nice if that was just more objective and clear cut. And then the rollover of the vacation, it gives a certain amount of time that you can roll over for vacation and a certain amount of time you can roll over for paid personal time. And it doesn't have a payout if you don't use it and you're going over those amounts. Now at this point, the fire chief is our only long-term employee other than some of the other firefighters. And so it only really applies in that case, but there should be a decent policy there, because I believe if we're looking at it, it depends what the board might want to determine on that, but I believe he's probably lost time if we're counting it that way, because there was no version of a payout, there's no larger rollover the way it's set up, so that should be talked about as well. That's why it's a discussion item on here. Next, we have the Noise Ordinance, and this came up because of Thunderbird asking for an extension because there's a new owner, and Thunderbird was so busy last year, and they hadn't gotten any complaints with their half-an-hour extension. This year, we did a 45-minute extension. It was controversial, and the idea was brought up of having inconsistencies in the Noise Ordinance. The Noise Ordinance is part of the general ordinance, and so it's part of the nuisance in there, and so I included that in here for the board to discuss if we may want to ease those up for everyone, or how we might want to make that more consistent across everyone that it would apply to. Next, we have camping. A couple of trustees have brought this up, the idea of camping on your own land, and it ends up being a more complex issue than it would initially appear with a longer history. And anytime you're dealing with law that's been in place for a decently long time, the area is developed with that law in place, so with that law in mind. And so I included a part from what we have now, which allows camping for, I believe, 30 days, maybe with a renewal, on your own piece of land if you also can show that you have access to sanitary facilities. And that ends up, of course, being one of the major concerns is access to water and waste disposal on those spots, and if it's going to be over winter, if it can handle snow loads and those types of things. I included, Andrea, I had type up the ordinance. We actually have a copy of the entire 1957 ordinance, which is awesome. I found someone in the village that their parents had a copy from 1957, and so got a copy of that made up. We only have a physical copy, but the section that would apply for here, I had Andrea type up 2 sections. There would be another section that would apply as well. But it goes over, even in 1957, this idea of you have to have inspection by the building inspector, you have to be approved for these types of things by the county health department, and that type of thing. And so it's worthy of discussion. It becomes a more complex issue than it would first appear. So rash changes with those policies would probably not be ideal. Next, we have the sewer rate and ordinance. And a couple of things here. I'll cover the rate, and then we'll cover the ordinance when I get into the reference packet. And so the sewer fund has been basically a financial disaster ever since the major projects were done in 2006. And the major one being up Whitehall Road, some down on River, of course, as well. And there's a ton that goes into this. We have a ton of paperwork on it. But basically, when it was put in up Whitehall Road, it bankrupted a trailer park. The township eventually ended up with that property back, and that's a loss of 90-some connections plus a bunch of debt that's not being paid for the bond, which was backed up by the county. So that plays into how this could play out. And it bankrupted a bar as well, and the Michigan Adventures didn't connect right away, and there ended up being 2 major court cases that went to the Michigan Court of Appeals. The township didn't fully win and didn't fully lose about the assessment of the REUs, and so ended up being not officially in a settlement, but agreement reached with Michigan Adventure in 2016 for $400,000 of the $600,000 that they were originally slotted to pay a decade before, which was just Michigan Adventure being nice to the township, and I'm not sure fully why they were quite that nice. And because in the Court of Appeals case that I read, I'm pretty sure it said 60 to 80 grand would be a reasonable amount. So why they paid so much more, I'm not sure. And then there was also negotiated in that same year $300,000 for flow meter reimbursements from the county, and that was just the county being nice to the township as well. So that $700,000 would float the fund, which was going broke, and those numbers hit in 2017, 2018, and essentially it pushed the bankruptcy of the sewer fund account to 2026 is when it drops down to officially zero, completely zero. But there's more to that, of course. There was the part along River Road, so then the contract is signed at the normal amount between municipalities that since they're doing maintenance and we're using part of their system, but it's on that border, we pay them 1.25 times their REU rates, and obviously they've raised their REU rates over time. Dalton Township hasn't raised the REU rates on the sewer since 2011, so it is set at $25 per REU per month, which is very low. And for instance, Laketon is at $45 per REU per month, so there's a big gap in there. And then Muskegon Charter, if what we're getting billed on, if you calculate it out from the rate we're contracted with for them from 2006, is $38.96 per RU per month. So there's a big gap there. So the township is probably losing about $20,000 a year on the portion on River Road. But if you calculate in the gap for the section up Whitehall Road, it's significantly more. I found various Excel spreadsheets with various calculations, but going up to a $2.5 million gap on funding for that portion. So it's a major problem that needs to be addressed, and I get that it's also a difficult problem. And so this idea of doing property sales to generate this extra revenue so that the township puts $500,000 into that fund, into that debt, and then raising the rates so that it'll stabilize. And we raise the rates above what we're paying Muskegon Charter Township. So they're at $38.96. So I had the rate analysis calculated in at $40 per RU per month. Then we're in a stable financial situation for that sewer fund, and then it just has to be renewed. The projections are that it would have to be renewed annually at a 4% increase. So just that, which is much more stable. If we weren't generating the extra revenue and the township deciding to put the funds in from land sales, then it would have to be a big jump a few years in a row and larger increases every year moving forward, and that's not an ideal solution. And I get that literally every version of this is controversial because the problem has to be solved and it is an issue. And so raising rates is obviously controversial, and then the idea of using money that could go towards something else for the township to pay down sewer debt is controversial because it means to a certain extent everyone in the township is carrying some of that burden for the sewer, which they're not connected to, which doesn't personally affect them. The issue with this is if it's just left to go broke, right? If I just leave it for the next guy to figure out, you end up in that idea of kicking the can, kick the can, kick the can. Eventually it'll be a disaster, classic government disaster, because no one's actually dealing with the problem because they all want to appear that everything's just hunky-dory right up to the disaster. The county signed for that bond, so the bond's going to get paid, right? The bond has to get paid. If the township went to $0, couldn't pay the bond, the county starts paying the bond. They would file documentation with the state to take our state revenue sharing. Now, 53% of the township budget is the state revenue sharing. So it would cut the township budget in half for however many years it would take, which it would take a few years for that bond to get paid. And so it would be a tremendous disaster. So we can't have that happen. The lawyer, talked to lawyers a number of times about the raising of the rates and the ordinance, which we'll get to the ordinance in a little while, is that wouldn't actually happen because you would just get to this final disaster and you would just raise the rates to whatever it would needed to be to essentially save the finances and not have the state revenue sharing taken, which would be an immense increase. I didn't have the numbers calculated if you get right up to the end point, but because we don't want those numbers calculated, it would be ridiculous. And so that's the basic situation with the sewer finances. And the board does not need to hold hearings and doesn't need to send notices for changing the sewer rate. But it hasn't been addressed since 2011 was the last time that sewer rate was changed. And it's not a great thing to just surprise people with. Now, we've been talking about it with the board, and we've been having a sewer rate study done for quite a while. We might be getting close to a year into it, something like that. So I'm sure people have heard about it, and that's good. And hopefully that information has gotten out there. That's why I post the board meeting packets online. That's why I record and post videos, and that's why I record and post meetings, so that the information is accessible. But I was like, it just doesn't feel good to do it without some sort of notice. And so I wrote up a letter and I included the resolution that I am proposing, and I included the graph showing when the fund would go broke if we do nothing. So showing that there's a major problem here that we need to address. And we're working on getting the list for all of the sewer users so we can get that mailing sent out so it can officially come for a decision vote to the Board of Trustees in the June meeting. So that is the plan there, and that should get sent out. Hopefully that letter will get sent out next week, so people will be informed about that. The reference packet, as I commonly do, is larger than the board packet. The board packet is decent size. I think it's 63 pages. The reference packet is way more. A big portion of this is the overview of the Arpa final rule. And now the reason I have an overview of it, which is only like 44 pages, somewhere in there, is because the actual final rule is over 400 pages, right? And I can't remember how big this is exactly, but this is like 150, right? So the final rule on the ARPA funds is like that thick. It's ridiculous, and so I wasn't going to print that entire thing. If people want it, I guess you can inquire with me, and I could show you the website or send you an email. And so those rules in here, if people want to reference them. I have some quotes for the audio visual system. I think I have all the quotes that I've acquired about that one. I have security quotes. I just had another security quote come in, but it was decently higher today, so it's not included in here. Website quotes, I have a couple in here with different approaches to doing the website as well. And so working on that. I had another one coming today. I have another meeting about it next week, and that'll take a little bit longer. Next, I have the Municode quotes about getting the ordinances online. And through that system, we can also post our meeting minutes, our resolutions, and our board packets, so people will be able to access all of those and hopefully in a smoother fashion. And so that'll work good and cut down on the cost that we need for the website and how it operates, because we don't need hundreds of PDFs. Right now, our website technically has like 283 pages if you count all of the PDFs separately, or probably a little more than that since we posted these, Andrea posted these packets yesterday. And so the Municode, well, I'll move on first, so we get that all operating and going and is decent. We can't miss any time with the website. And one important thing with the website is that we need to be able to post notices about meetings on there. Otherwise, the meetings are illegal, and we don't want to be holding illegal meetings, of course. I want people to know about them. I mean, I think the Open Meetings Act is super important. The fact that the governor can just fluctuate it anytime that she wants, I don't think is good at all. And so it's just been waving like a flag in the wind for the last couple of years, but nevertheless, it is an important overall idea and policy. And so we want that information. I want that information to be out there, and I want it to be out there and accessible and anytime people need it. And so we'll need to get Municode up and working and going properly and good first, and then the website. So the fact that I don't have all the website quotes in is fine, because it's going to be a bit longer. I have the Russell Lots comparable market analysis from Nexus, because they print out a pretty complicated market analysis. So I included that in here, even though they don't generate a specific number necessarily. I have the full appraisal for 2370 Duff Road included in here, which is decent size because it contains all the information. And then the sewer ordinance. And this is the last thing in the reference packet, so the final thing overall. There was a sewer ordinance written up by the law firm in 2011, but for some reason the ordinance itself never got passed, as far as we can tell. And when we did the rate analysis on the sewer to find out how we could approach, how big the problem was and how we could approach fixing the problem with the sewer finances, the guy that did that, Kazor, he also suggested that there's some gaps in the ordinance that should be addressed. And so I had the lawyers bring up that 2011 version and then adjust it to address Kazor's concerns as well. And so we're able to get that ordinance proper and in place at the same time that we're adjusting these rates, so things are proper moving forward. And that's everything that's happening and included in this meeting. So it's a decent amount of stuff. We're really trying to tackle stuff. And before a meeting occurs, I'm already working on the next month's meeting, right? And so I see important stuff occurring down the line for a ways. There are major resolutions that we either don't have in place or they haven't been updated in a long time for like the Treasury Department. And so we're knocking things down, just like we had an expenditure policy in the past that we found we didn't have it. The township just started operating like that at some point. I don't know when, right? At some point in the last several or few years somewhere, the township started operating like it had one, but it didn't have one. And so it's not even legal, and it's certainly not proper. And so we got that in place, and we found a few more things like that. So we're working on getting those corrected, but those aren't until the June meeting. Those will be brought up either for discussion or maybe decision right at that time. And so it's a decent amount of stuff, of course, but trying to set things up and knock them down, find problems and fix them is the name of the game. And there are a lot. There's no lack of activity and no lack of projects. And so there's quite a bit here. If anyone has any questions, feel free to give me a call. Feel free to give me an email. My direct line at the office is area code 231-332-6700. And my direct email is supervisor@daltontownship.org or jeffrey.martin@daltontownship.org. So either way, feel free to reach out. And then, of course, once we get the audiovisual system updated for the meetings, they'll be a lot easier to hear and see and understand. And so people will be able to get information that way better as well. And I'll work on shooting some separate videos for some of the other issues. Like I'm trying to gather information on the lake levels, the lake level outlet device. So I have some updates there, and I'll work on shooting separate videos for those as I get more information, so we can make some knowledgeable decisions and at least know what the situation is on those types of things. All right, if there's anything else, feel free to reach out.